Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for episode 2 of BlueCast. I'm glad to have you with us. On our first episode, we talked about heroic doses and what that is. You can check in the comments below if you want to see that video. So I figure for our second episode, it would be a good thing to talk about ego death, because that's probably what's going to happen if you take a heroic dose. So we're just going to kind of go through what is ego death and talk about some cultures that have their version of that or their explanation of what that is. So in Sufism, there's a term called fana, which is annihilation of all remembrance of other. So fana in Sufism essentially is the utter annihilation of the self. It translates sort of directly to die before one dies. So some Sufis define this as the annihilation of the human ego before God, and when this happens, the self becomes like an instrument of God's will. Another interpretation of this is the dissolving of the individual ego and like a recognition of the fundamental unity of everything. I do want to mention that the second interpretation there is condemned as heretical by Orthodox Islam. So, for whatever that's worth. So, moving on to Buddhism. In Zen Buddhism, the practice of meditation can lead you to a sort of ego death. It's the liberation of yourself from the things that you use to define your existence. There's a term in Buddhism called tathata, Tathata, which means thusness or suchness. The idea is that there's a nature of reality that you can enter into that is free from the subject and object relationship. So there's no discernment between you and everything else. There's only the suchness, the everything at once happening. And then so moving on to psychology, in Jungian psychology, which is kind of out there a little bit sometimes, there's obviously a big focus on the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the ego, among other things. One concept that Jung wrote about was something called psychic death, which is the breaking free from whatever identifier that you have with yourself, whether that's a pattern of behavior or like a role that you play in society or values or whatever. It's essentially the psychological death of your attachment to whatever idea. Nietzsche also coined a term called the transcendent function. Here he is, live, to tell you about what that entails. By means of the transcendent function, we not only gain access to the one mind, but also come to understand why the East believes in the possibility of self-liberation. If, through introspection and the conscious realization of unconscious compensations, it is possible to transform one's mental condition and thus arrive at a solution of painful conflicts, one would seem entitled to speak of self-liberation. Wow, it was really cool that we could have him on to get that clip. Are you still with me? It's kind of heavy. But there's a common theme here that these philosophies have with their own, respective definitions of what an ego death is. It is the lack of ability, or maybe even the need, to describe the difference between yourself and everything else. It's the unraveling of the connections that you have with your reality. It's the letting go of yourself, of your ego, and like surrendering to the fact that you are the same essence as everything else. But what's it feel like, man? What's it feel like on drugs, man? It's essentially what's described here. In order to truly have an ego death, you wouldn't exactly have what we would call a clear memory of the experience. like was stated before, there's no discernment between yourself and the other things of your universe. To put it another way, there's literally no way to describe the things around you because there's nothing to compare them with. Like, how would you compare an apple and an orange if you saw no difference between apples and oranges? You wouldn't be able to describe the difference between them. Nor could you describe the apples or the oranges on their own because it's all the same stuff in your head. It's the same happening everywhere. You're fucking one with everything, man. So how do you remember that there's something you can't describe? Like, how do you recall something that has no description? I'm not saying that there are no words to describe the experience. I think even though language is sort of self-referential, you can find ways to describe just about anything. But relaying the experience when it comes to an ego death is more of a emotional thing, maybe, as opposed to a verbal one. It's really like the reason why people have such a difficult time putting their psychedelic experiences into words. Alan Watts said that an interesting quality of LSD was that the natural duality of things becomes apparent. Like, it was an innate ability to fully grasp the idea that you can't have good times without bad times, or vice versa. You can understand the totality of the concept. So it's like if you could imagine good and bad on a pole, you, instead of seeing the good and focusing on the good, you see the whole pole as it exists. Hopefully that helps explain that a little bit. In an ego death experience, you'll find that you inherently have this ability, or it's just like the way things are, that you're part of something non-dual, that you're beyond like poles or polar things like black and white. It's just like everything is all together. You're viewing the duality of nature from a third person perspective. So you're viewing the essence or non-essence of the totality of reality in an ego death. Okay, so you're in an ego death experience and you're experiencing these things. So what is that like? You're unable to discern one thing from another. Sometimes this manifests as like an all-encompassing white light. This is really typical for like a 5-MeO DMT experience, which is essentially like a guaranteed ego death if you're doing that substance. You're not existing within time because there's no separation from one moment to another. It's like that idea of be here now. Like, you're existing in the here and now. There's no future, there's no past. It's just this thing happening. This like suchness is happening. You no longer identify as yourself, It's an ego death. Your ego's dead. The you that you're familiar with kind of evaporates into the air along with everything else. And for the reasons I just mentioned, recalling anything from this experience is going to be intensely difficult, if not impossible, for most people. Typically, what you come back with is conceptual. Ideas like we're all one and be here now tend to naturally emerge out of these spaces for the people that experience this. So if you're looking into the ego death experience, it's important to focus not just on the actual ego death itself, but the coming into it and the coming out of it is also pretty important, because it's an ego death experience can feel a lot like dying. Like, a lot of people go into their ego death experiences having the thought of, fuck, I'm about to die. My God, I'm going to die. And they're sort of rewarded with the ego death experience. But the important thing is being willing to give into it and not resist it. Because if you resist it, it's going to be trouble. Your body's wanting to do one thing and you're telling it to do another. And so that usually doesn't go well. So yet again, one more reason to have a trip sitter. You're letting go of your physical body and existing in an entirely mental one. Your body will continue to perform its natural processes like breathing and beating your heart, but you won't be there to witness that. Having a friend or even a physician around is really going to help you have a safer, more comfortable experience. If you end up fighting the ego death, things can get squirrely. It can result in like feelings of dread or despair. It can lead to temporary psychosis. It's uncomfortable. It's not good. Just give in, let go. It's okay. It's going to be okay. You're fine. You're safe. Coming out of an ego death experience, equally important, because the way that you deal with the experience afterwards is going to impact like ultimately what you get out of it. You can emerge from that kind of experience and, you know, somewhat rightfully believe that you're God. You can think you're the Buddha or like Napoleon. You can have psychosis coming out of this because it is such a powerful experience that when you emerge out of it, it's a lot to process. But my recommendation would be to give it time and integrate your experience with your non-drugs induced reality. If you try and integrate your experience while you're tripping, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good for when you're not tripping. You know, you can definitely take time and think about it while you're tripping, and I would encourage that. But the important work, you know, if you're doing these trips with an intention, is going to happen after the experience and like applying sort of the information that you've gleaned out of the experience. The reality that you're experiencing on hallucinogens is not the reality that you experience when you're sober and you go to work or when you talk to friends or family or anything else. You have to really be conscious of that, because taking things literally out of a psychedelic experience can lead people down weird roads. You can get like real deep into woo-woo that has no impact on your life, and you essentially will be wasting the experience. I mean, you can have fun on an acid trip. You can have fun having an ego death. You don't always have to pull something mystical or informational or whatever out of it. You can just have fun. But if you are doing this with intention, my point is, you know, do the work after you've come down. So I hope this video has been informative. I hope it's been entertaining. I hope you like the background. We're here in my lovely yard. As always, there is a link to our Discord community down there. We are almost at 17,000 people there, so I would love for you to join us so we can hit that number. Really appreciate you guys watching. If you would like and subscribe to this video, it really goes a long way to getting this content to more people. And so does you sharing this video. So please don't forget to share this video with your friends, your coworkers. Send it to your mom. Send it to your dad. Watch it with your grandma. Everybody loves this stuff. And please, in the comments, if you guys have ideas or things that you would like to see in future episodes, please let me know, because I'll totally do that. So yeah, thanks you guys for watching, and until next time, spread love.